Bitch, where's my money? If you want to help me out, you can subscribe to me on Patreon, which is Grimachu, on Subscribestar, which is Grim-Jim, or if you want to make a one-off donation to help support me and keep the channel going, you can do so at paypal.me/JDesborough. Thanks. Hello lovelies. We're going to talk about some difficult subjects today, and I mean difficult in various ways. Some of what I'm going to talk about today will challenge your preconceptions. You will have cognitive bias about some of these things. You will already have made your mind up about some of these things and your interpretation of some of these things. It's just asking you, please, take a breath, keep an open mind, try to use your head more than your heart as we go through this. It's a difficult thing. I understand that. I have my own biases and inclinations. You know, I'm a peace-loving hippie. I'm a utopian socialist in a pragmatic sense. Yeah, I'm aware of the lenses and biases through which I see the world, but that doesn't necessarily make them escapable. But the first step in compensating for those biases is understanding that you have them in the first place. So maybe just take a moment, open your mind, use your head rather than your heart. For the most part, some of this is going to be emotional. Set aside any raw feelings or pained nerves that you have, and just try and take all of this on board as I walk you through it, because it was hard for me as well. I'm drawing pretty heavily on the work of Erica Chenoweth. Now, like many of us, I think, because violent resistance has this glamour to it, because it's so exciting and interesting and it makes a wonderful narrative. Because of a lot of that, not saying because of the media, but just because I'm saying because that kind of story appeals to us in the first place. I think to many of us it seems like a common sense idea that violent revolution, terrorism by any other name, is obviously the most effective way to go. The violent removal of oppressors intuitively and obviously feels like the right thing to do. The better story, the better narrative. And when we look back on history, it's most often the violent revolutions, the civil wars, that kind of thing that holds our attention, and much less often the non-violent change, the progressive change, the glacial Fabian change over time to governments and powers becoming more enlightened. Now, Chenoweth, in her work, she thought that initially, and then was sort of challenged in a workshop on her ideas about that. And there hadn't been a proper comparison study between the two, so she set out to make one. So her and her colleagues looked at all the kind of regime change or overthrow of the system, or looked at all of these examples, both violent and non-violent, from around 1900 to around 2006. And she surprised herself, I think, if you read interviews with her, in that she discovered that in the aggregate, non-violent resistance, non-violent civil action and disobedience and strikes and all the rest of it was far, far more successful than violent resistance in creating change. Approximately 10 times more effective. Now, social science doesn't have the best reputation at the moment. There's a replicability problem, but from what I've been able to discern, this seems to tick all the boxes of having been done right, subjected to proper peer review, all the rest of it. And even if there were biases involved, 10 times more effective, that's a huge differential to try and account for through study bias and so on. It's huge. Even if it was twice more effective, that would be an amazing and astounding statistic. So keep that in mind. But why? Why is it that non-violent protest and disobedience and change, why is it that that's so much more effective? Chenoweth identifies a whole bunch of factors. I'm not going to go into all of them, and I'm going to add in my own bias and information here, but I'm going to pick out the ones that I think are the most important. One of the most important aspects of non-violent protest is that it has a very low bar to participation. If you're asking someone to pick up a gun and put their life on the line and blow up their neighborhood and kill people, it's a big ask. So you're immediately losing a lot of potential support from people who don't want to risk what little they have. This is why there's so much inertia in systems anyway, because if resistance is more costly than going along with the status quo, if you can't find a place, if you can't be safe and secure for your family, that is when people get pushed over the edge. So it's when things get really bad that we do see violent revolution. But if you want to make a change in a society that, for all its problems, bumps along kind of okay in a sort of functional manner, you've got a lot of problems doing that. Non-violent resistance naturally has a fairly broad base because it doesn't force people into deprivation or life-threatening situations. These things all work together. If your cause is just and peaceful, you should get the majority of support from people of conscience without really having to make too much of an effort. Whereas if you make it too narrow, too exclusionary, too many aspects to agree with, then you start losing that broad base. More on that in a bit. Non-violent resistance doesn't violate people's morality. Most people don't want to kill, most people don't want to destroy or loot, riot or burn or steal or any of these things. So if you keep things peaceful, then it doesn't violate their personal morality, their ethics. They can side with your cause, however tacitly or passively, without being seen to approve violence and death. The destruction of property, because the destruction of property is not just the destruction of property. It destroys people's lives and their ability to look after their families and to live and to eat, all of those kind of things. It's all very well regarding property as just property, but nothing is free of context. There is impact, and there is impact from that impact, and so on. Now, if you remain non-violent in your protest, and the state or whoever else the oppressor is in this case resorts to violence, you automatically gain the moral high ground. You force the state actor to play the part of the villain. Whereas if you participate in violence, you become as bad as them. Plus, you're then fighting overwhelming state power on their terms, violence and physicality. And they will usually win in that circumstance, because they have the tools, they have the trained fighters, they have the military and the police and the paramilitary forces. You're going to lose. Second Amendment or not, you're probably going to lose if you fight the state on its terms, and if you violate the morality of people who would otherwise support you. There's some fine examples of this. I did a video quite some time ago on the Battle of Cable Street, which you can probably find if you go and look it up. This was when the British Union of Fascists were set to march through London, and they were stopped by an alliance of socialists, Jews, anarchists, just left-wing working class people from the labour movement and so on. They flooded the street, they stopped them being able to march, beat a few of them up, got into clashes with police. And this is often thought of as a grand victory for the left in Britain and for British intolerance of fascism. It's not the whole story. At the time, the British Union of Fascists was on the way out. Their membership was declining. People weren't so sympathetic towards them. They were looking towards Europe and thinking, maybe this isn't such a good idea. But at the Battle of Cable Street, Oswald Mosley cooperated with the police and peacefully withdrew. And as a result of that, and all the violence that the left-wing groups had engaged in and the battles with the police and so on, they very much lost the support of the public. And for a while, the fortunes of the British Union of Fascists reversed, and they did quite well again. They never quite got so high as the support they got from the Daily Mail again, but for a while their fortunes reversed as a result of the violence and the attacks on police and so on that the left-wing alliance had engaged in. Now, I think it's something we can be justly and rightly proud of, that people came together to shove out the fascists, but tactically wasn't such a good idea, and the result wasn't so good overall. For a more recent example, we can look at the punching of Richard Spencer. It might feel good. Was it tactically a good idea? Well, Richard Spencer's social media presence doubled, then doubled again in a handful of days in the aftermath of that. Many more people were watching him, seeing what he was saying, reading what he was saying. It made his profile much higher, made the protesters look irrational and violent. It helped him. So the important lesson I think here is don't violate people's morality. Stay peaceful, even in the face of provocation. Force your enemies to become the violent and repressive force. Now, it takes more than protests as well. Marching in the street by itself doesn't accomplish much, and certainly hasn't accomplished much since the turn of the century. The government seem to have worked out how to ignore or reframe mass protests, especially when they end in riots and property damage and violence and police women in comas and things like that, right? It's easy to lose people that way, but it takes more than that. You need to actually do something that will hurt. Having a grand parade is all well and good for raising awareness and so on, but it doesn't make much difference. I should know, I've been on a few. So you have to do more than that. You have to strike, you have to boycott, you have to stay home. But it also needs to be a mass movement. Chenoweth studies suggest that you need somewhere between 3 and 4% of the population, which doesn't sound like that much, but you need between 3 and 4% of the population on board with some kind of mass protest or civil movement for there to be change. And that change may not be immediate, but it will happen, provided you keep going and you do more than march and shout. You have to hurt people, but you don't have to hurt people with violence. There are other options. And you have to stay the course. It takes time. You have to stick it out. You have to accept the pain, which is why it's important to keep the pain so much lower. People in other countries have done things like banging their pots and pans as a sign of protest, which doesn't require people to go out to the street or congregate in any one particular area. Or they've gone on electricity strikes, where they just switch everything off for an hour or a day. People used to use staying home as a protest before the lockdown, of course. But you can starve the system of money by refusing to buy, by refusing to go out, by refusing to spend. And that then causes business interests, which unfortunately have a lot of power in our plutocratic systems, to apply pressure for you to the government to push reform. Boycotts do the same thing. There was a hugely effective boycott campaign in South Africa while apartheid was still going. So what happened was a lot of black people were employed by the white capitalist class, and a mass boycott went into effect where the black community, which is the majority in South Africa, refused to buy anything from any white-owned stores. Probably a bit unfair. Probably plenty of white people were on board with reform and getting rid of apartheid, but it worked because those shops, those businesses were still employing black people, largely because they had no choice. So they were paying out wages to the black community, but the black community was not paying into that white owner class's pockets. And that was hugely effective and caused that capitalist class to apply pressure to the government. Hashtags are kind of ridiculous, but they do work to an extent. You can look at things like Me Too, for all that it's gone off the rails, and you can see that that is effective. Online activism, while it's often risible, often stupid, often doesn't land, can be effective. Why? because it directly attacks and affects the media class who are all over Twitter, and because it's such a low bar to participation, which allows just about anybody who even remotely agrees with whatever message it is you're pushing to join in. It creates itself as a story. Another key aspect that Chenoweth identifies is preparation. So if you're going into a long strike or a long sit down or shut in, staying home, whatever, you want to minimize the hardship to the people participating. So you want to lay in stores of food and water and whatever else you might need to stay the course. Spontaneity is great, but nothing beats preparation, and that will allow you to stay the course longer, and staying the course is another one of the big factors that makes it work. Communication is important. This is one of the things that I keep pushing and banging on about, because so much of protest culture is now tied up in this pseudo-academic, pseudo-left-wing culture in universities. And the language that you're using within critical theory, within racial studies, gender studies, it's not something that translates to the real world. I mean, systemic or structural racism isn't actually racism. It's the emergent effects of policies that disproportionately affect black and minority ethnic people. At least that seems to be the most coherent explanation I've had of it. Defund the police doesn't actually mean defund the police. How can you hope to communicate with people when you have to spend 2 or 3 pages explaining your hashtag? Yeah, it does. It just doesn't work. Communication is important. The common touch, common language is important. Many of us, I understand perfectly, many of us are irrationally wedded to certain terms. I will die on the hill of explaining to people what socialism is before I change the words that I use, even though it would be more effective to just say, okay, fine, welfare capitalism, whatever. You know, we all have these weak points, these blind spots. But if you want to be effective, at some point you're going to have to bend, or the movement as a whole is going to have to bend and use common language, commonly understood terminology. Bad communication is a huge personal bugbear of mine. But these are some of the main things that she's identified that are most effective about peaceful protest. Before the internet, I had pen pals. And one of the pen pals that I had, in the sort of spirit of glasnost, I suppose, was a young woman named Teodora Marenciu, from Romania. And I wrote to her before, through and after the Romanian Revolution of 1989. She would send me letters on repurposed and recycled paper on envelopes made from Romanian magazines. She sent me this bunny rabbit, which I treasure greatly, and I just realised is partially green, so we'll probably have holes through it on the screen. But as you can see, it's a bit dull and shabby. It was when I got it, made of recovered fabric, but made with love and care. I used to call her Tess because I mistook her cursive handwriting D for an S at the time. So yeah, I, even before the internet, had a friend on the ground in a country that was leading up to and then having its revolution. Most of the revolutions in Eastern Europe were pretty peaceful. One domino fell after another. It was a velvet revolution for the most part. Less so in Romania. But even in the case of Romania, I think the rule that non-violent protest is what leads to change holds true. There was a lot of stuff leading up to this. Writing to Teodora, I saw the way in which Western culture was infiltrating, if that's the right word, Romania, how people were becoming discontent, how the loosening up of restrictions allowed her to talk to me and me to talk to her, and even to send her mixtapes of Western music that she couldn't get otherwise. Yeah, it was an eye-opener. And part of the reason, despite being very left-wing, I no longer have that much patience with communists. at least ones who apologise for Soviet regimes and so on. Weren't really communist, but it's kind of beside the point here. The final spark that lit the revolt was the oppression and repression of a particular religious leader. That led to mass protests, which led to crackdowns, which then, in turn, led to more protests and riots and a bit of violence here and there, which led to a vicious crackdown, which was so vicious that in asking the military to become demons, a whole bunch of them became angels, and then you essentially had a civil war between the loyalist and rebel factions of the military, and that's when it descended into a bloodbath. When Ceausescu was finally cornered and captured, him and his wife were shot by firing squad for crimes of genocide and others. It was a bit of a kangaroo court, but these are the kind of things that happen in these kind of revolutions. But it started out from peace, and the largely peaceful protests forced the government to be the bad guy, to be the violent oppressor, to play that role, and the military rebelled against that. So even here, in one of the most violent overthrows in Eastern Europe, in that whole period of revolution and change, even here, it's non-violent protest and sticking it out and sticking to non-violent protest that eventually led to change. And the violence that made the change happen came from the state, because it was forced to play the part of the evil oppressor. So how is our moment comparing with all this? And not particularly well, I would say. The protests went well. The rioting and the looting cost support. The excuses for the rioting and looting cost support, however understandable it might be. The vandalism is costing support. The anti-Semitism in many of the left-wing groups involved is costing support. I don't think this requires external agitators. It's just the nature of intersectionality. It fragments these movements and makes them practically useless, because you can't just be on board with the idea that black lives should matter as much as anybody else's and police brutality is a bad idea. You have to sign up with things like defund the police, which apparently doesn't actually mean defund the police. But there's another problem. Using these kinds of academic terms, these critical theory terms, the gender studies and race studies terms, doesn't play well with the public. And if you need to spend 2 or 3 pages explaining what your hashtag really means, you failed at the hashtag. Over here, there's a lot of fuss about tearing down statues. Colston in Bristol, who was pulled down and thrown in the water. Cecil Rhodes in Oxford. Trouble is, these are people in history, and as a historian, I'm always wary of, well, he who fails to learn from history is doomed to repeat it, as the saying goes, and I think 50 years down the line we'll regret it if we don't keep these statues around. Of course, attempts have been made through proper process to add plaques or something to contextualise Colston, but they didn't get anywhere, because historically he was a Conservative, and so the Conservative Party councillors and so on are against any kind of change there. But it's also more complicated than that, because history is history, and there's always shades of grey, and every hero has a feat of clay, and every villain has something positive in their closet, pretty much. Colston, for all he was a bastard slaver, or at least a slave transporter to get technical, which is how he was able to get away with it, he ploughed an enormous amount of money into what might be considered progressive causes. Almshouses for the poor, education for the poor, massive investments into charity, and particularly religions. Of course, he was a bit of a bastard there as well, because he only really offered arms support and so on to people who shared his religion or signed on to his religion, but nonetheless, it's not pure and unalloyed villainy. And that's Colston, a relatively obscure figure who most people won't bother to go and look up. I'll just go, oh, slaver, right, fair enough. When you deface the cenotaph or Winston Churchill's statue, then you're going to run into more of a problem. Because, yeah, Churchill was an horrible cunt. He was an unabashed racist, deeply suspicious figure. He put Boers in concentration camps, a bit of a bastard. A very witty, clever, funny bastard, exactly the kind of person we needed to stick through World War II, but a bastard. But most people aren't going to know that about Winston. They are going to know him as the British bulldog who stood against the Boche. Yeah, this avatar figure for British doggedness and determination in the face of Nazi bombings and so on. So most people aren't going to understand when you deface that, or when you deface the cenotaph, which commemorates those who've fallen in war, many of whom were working class and probably would be on your side. This costs support. It costs a lot of legitimate political support that might otherwise stand behind you and make change more possible. We see the Labour Party of today distancing itself from the vandalism. It costs you support. But the biggest thing, I think, is this occupyification of the movement. You can have a singular cause that will give you a huge broad base of support, but once you start chopping that up, once you start involving intersectionality, once you start saying, okay, you have to be for black lives and you have to be against police brutality, cool, but we're going to defund the police. Only that doesn't mean defund the police. You need to be for all of these other political things, which to a lot of people smack of communism or whatever. You're losing support. What about black trans people? You start dividing. What about the LGBT community within the black community? You start splitting the support again, because there's a lot of homophobia in the black community, unfortunately. So it's breaking apart already. Whether the core can keep going, stay the course, stick to a simplistic message, rein in the violence and make actual change remains to be seen, but I think you have a better chance if you're peaceful and if you force the forces of repression and oppression to play the part of the villain by remaining peaceful and giving them the monopoly on violence. That helps change people's minds, and already is. So there's hope. There's always hope, even when it turns violent. Zang.
Satana Station is an addition to Machinations of the Space Princess. It's a whole sleazy space station, full of locations, services, adventures and inspiration for your old school space opera games. Over 100 locations, a bevy of non-player characters, and more plot hooks than you can shake an Arcturo Mega Stick at. Buy it at post-mort.com, drive-through RPG, and hard copy at lulu.com.